You'd never imagine how many mistakes it takes to forge a history story. We will dig deep into the iceberg of tragic history, from the bad news of countless deaths caused by arrogance to those global disasters that set back world civilization. This journey will be very crazy. Let's start from the top. Tier 1. The surface. Famous technological and engineering disasters. The sinking of the Titanic. The Unsinkable. Arrogance. This isn't just a story about a ship. It's a parable about human pride written in frozen steel and drowned bodies. In 1912, the RMS Titanic was the gleaming, thrumming miracle of the industrial age. It was a 46,000-ton middle finger to the untamable power of the ocean. The press, the public, the builders themselves, they all gave it a fatal nickname, the Unsinkable. That label wasn't a hope, it was a curse, a magic spell that lulled everyone into a deadly stupor. Imagine you are in the first-class lounge of this floating palace, elegantly enjoying the music. From the richest industrialists to the poorest people in steerage, everyone was wrapped in this false sense of security. Captain Edward Smith, a distinguished old sailor with 40 years of sailing experience, was about to retire with honor, but he too was lost in this sea of optimism. His final voyage was meant to be a coronation. The ship's wireless operators were swamped, not with vital messages about the ship's safety, but with personal telegrams from the wealthy passengers, who were treating the state-of-the-art Marconi system like their personal plaything, sending stock tips and dinner party invitations across the Atlantic. They received at least 6 distinct serious iceberg warnings from other ships that day. 6. One from the Caronia, another from the Baltic, a crucial one from the Mesaba, which pinpointed a massive field of ice directly in the Titanic's path. That final, critical warning never even made it to the bridge. The exhausted radio operator, Jack Phillips, saw it as non-urgent and put it aside. Another ship, the Californian, was so close it was surrounded by ice and had stopped for the night. Its radio operator tried to warn the Titanic, only to be arrogantly rebuffed by Phillips, who snapped back, "Shut up! Shut up! I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Even more fatally, the ship's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay of the White Star Line, was aboard and wanted to make a splash. He allegedly pressured Captain Smith to maintain a high speed, hoping to beat the crossing record of the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. They were charging at nearly 22 knots, almost full speed, into a known pitch-black ice field on a moonless night. They were like a blindfolded giant running toward a cliff. Why? For a good headline. The lookouts in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were working without binoculars. The ship's binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the key had been left behind in Southampton by an officer who was transferred at the last minute. When Fleet finally saw the mountain of ice with his own eyes, he rang the bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge, screaming, "Iceberg, right ahead." It was already too late. The steel behemoth they called Unsinkable scraped along the ancient ice. It didn't create a massive gash, as films often depict, but a series of smaller punctures below the waterline, popping rivets and buckling the hull plates like a can opener. The ship was designed to stay afloat with 4 of its 16 watertight compartments flooded. The Iceberg had compromised 6, and that's when the second, more unforgivable mistake was exposed. The lifeboats. There were only 20 of them, enough for about half the 2,200 people on board. This was technically legal, as maritime safety laws were dangerously outdated, but it was morally bankrupt. Why so few? To keep the first-class promenade deck from looking cluttered. Over 1,500 souls sacrificed for speed, aesthetics, and arrogance were swallowed by the icy black waters of the Atlantic, where the water temperature was a fatal 2°C. The sinking of the Titanic taught us a lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. When technology outpaces humility, tragedy is the only destination. Every time we board a ship today and see those ugly but plentiful orange lifeboats, we are hearing the whispers of those 1,500 ghosts. The Hindenburg disaster. Shortcut. May 6, 1937, Lakehurst, New Jersey. The LZ-129 Hindenburg, a silver giant longer than 3 Boeing 777s, is silently gliding through the stormy sky. It isn't just an airship. It's a swastika emblazoned technological icon of Nazi Germany, the most luxurious and romantic way to cross the Atlantic. For a fraction of the price of an ocean liner ticket, you could dine in a fine restaurant, sleep in a private cabin, and watch the ocean drift by from a panoramic viewing deck, all while floating through the clouds. A crowd on the ground stares up in awe as radio announcer Herbert Morrison narrates the spectacular sight to the nation. But everyone is ignoring a deadly truth. The skin of this flying palace is stretched over a highly flammable dope, and its massive gas bags are filled with 7 million cubic feet of the ultimate bomb, hydrogen gas. Helium was the safe choice, the inert gas that doesn't burn. The problem? The world's biggest producer of helium was the United States, and the US, wary of a rising aggressive Nazi Germany, had passed the Helium Act of 1925, banning its export for military use. The Hindenburg was designed to use helium. But faced with the American embargo, the Germans had to re-engineer it to use highly flammable hydrogen. They knew the danger. They implemented ridiculously strict safety measures on board. All matches and lighters were confiscated. The crew wore special anti-static shoes. They took a shortcut, and they made a bet. They gambled that a tiny spark of static electricity, perhaps from the stormy weather, would never ever happen. And then, it happened. As Morrison famously transitioned from calm narration to horrified screaming, it burst into flames. Oh, the humanity! A flicker of fire erupted from the Hindenburg's tail. The hydrogen inside, seeking oxygen, ignited. In just 34 seconds, the entire airship turned into a falling fireball. Its duralumin skeleton twisted and snapped in the inferno, crashing to the ground like a dying prehistoric beast. Miraculously, of the 97 people on board, 62 survived, many by jumping from the burning wreckage, but 36 people perished. This apocalyptic scene, captured on film and broadcast to the world, instantly ended the golden age of passenger airship travel. A simple error in chemical choice, a compromise born from politics and profit, turned an entire industry to ash overnight. The silent, majestic kings of the sky were grounded forever, replaced by the louder, cruder, but at least less flammable airplane. The Chernobyl disaster. The poisoned wind. Lies. April 26, 1986. Pripyat, a model Soviet city in Ukraine. In the control room of Chernobyl's reactor number 4, a deputy chief engineer named Anatoly Dyatlov is overseeing a long overdue safety test. The irony is so thick it's suffocating. Dyatlov, a brilliant but notoriously stubborn and abrasive manager, was determined to complete the test, which had already been delayed. The test's purpose was to see if during a power outage, the spinning turbines could generate enough electricity to keep the vital cooling pumps running for the crucial minute it took for the backup diesel generators to kick in. To run this test, under Dyatlov's bullying supervision, the engineers made a series of textbook fatal errors, violating one safety protocol after another. They disabled the automatic shutdown systems, essentially pulling the brakes out of the reactor. They reduced the power to a dangerously unstable level, far below what was safe for the test. The reactor was becoming a barely controlled nuclear bomb. The junior operators knew it. They expressed concern, but Dyatlov threatened them into continuing. They were like children playing with matches in a room full of dynamite, annoyed that the fire sprinklers were in their way. At 1:23 a.m., the game was over. Someone hit the emergency shutdown button, AZ5. In a catastrophic design flaw of the RBMK-type reactor, the graphite-tipped control rods, meant to shut the reaction down, actually caused a massive power spike when first inserted into the unstable core. The reactor's power surged to over 100 times its normal output. A massive steam explosion, followed by a second, more powerful blast, blew the 2,000-ton lid clean off the reactor. A volcano of graphites, uranium, and fission products erupted into the night sky, painting it with a beautiful but deadly rainbow-colored flame. But the real mistake, the one darker and uglier than the explosion itself, came next. Lie. The first response from the bureaucrats in Moscow wasn't evacuation, it was a cover-up. They refused to believe the reactor core had exploded. They told the world it was a small fire, that everything was under control, as the lethal, invisible cloud of radiation, 400 times more than the Hiroshima bomb, drifted across Europe. The citizens of Pripyat were unknowingly celebrating the weekend. They gathered on a railway bridge, later nicknamed the Bridge of Death, to watch the beautiful fire, completely unaware that they were being showered with fatal doses of radiation. The first firefighters, the liquidators, arrived with no protection, fighting an invisible demon with their bare hands. They died in unimaginable agony weeks later from acute radiation sickness. This wasn't an explosion, it's a curse that will last for tens of thousands of years. Chernobyl didn't just leave behind a 1,000 square mile exclusion zone and a ghost town that still radiates death. It planted a deep seed of fear about nuclear energy in the global consciousness. And that second disaster, the one made of lies, denial, and bureaucracy, was every bit as toxic as the plutonium in the reactor's molten core. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, the falling star, pressure. This is a terrifying story about a phenomenon called the normalization of deviance. It's about how an organization, even one as brilliant as NASA, can know about a fatal flaw, see it fail time and time again in small ways, and slowly begin to accept that risk as normal until it's too late. January 28th, 1986. Millions of schoolchildren across America were gathered around classroom televisions, their faces filled with excitement. This wasn't just another space launch. This was special. Krista McAuliffe, a vibrant high school social studies teacher from New Hampshire, was going to be the first ordinary citizen in space. It was a symbol of national pride, a brilliant PR move to reinvigorate public interest in the space program. But on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral that morning, the temperature had dropped to a freezing 0.5 Droxa, 31 ppf, far colder than it had ever been for a launch. Icicles hung from the launch tower. Engineers from Rwandan, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, were in a state of panic. They knew this was a potential death sentence. The cold could cause the crucial rubber O-rings that sealed the booster joints to become brittle and fail. They had data showing this. One of the engineers, Roger Boisjoli, had even written a memo months earlier warning of a potential catastrophe. For hours the night before, he and his colleagues begged NASA managers to postpone the launch. But NASA was under immense pressure. The shuttle program was behind schedule, facing budget cuts, and they needed this high-profile launch to be a success. A high-level NASA manager, frustrated with the engineers' pleas, infamously said, "My God, Tyoko, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The company's executives, feeling the heat from their biggest client, caved. They overruled their own engineers and formally recommended to proceed with the launch. 73 seconds after liftoff, in front of a global audience of over 1 billion people, including Krista's horrified parents, the engineers' worst fears came true. A jet of flame, visible as a small puff of black smoke at liftoff, had burst from a failed O-ring seal. It acted like a blowtorch, burning through the external fuel tank. The Space Shuttle Challenger was torn apart in a horrifying Y-shaped cloud of smoke and fire, nearly 9 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. The dream became a national nightmare. This mistake made O-ring a household term for catastrophic failure and institutional arrogance. It shattered America's romantic view of space exploration and served as a brutal lesson that when you ignore the warnings of experts because of pressure and deadlines, the price is paid in human lives. These stories are huge and tragic, but at least we can know how they happened. However, when a leader makes an arrogant judgment, it will cause the whole world to bleed. Tier 2. Below the surface, consequential political and military misjudgments. Archduke Ferdinand's open-top tour, the wrong turn. Coincidence. History can be a dark comedy, and its punchline often depends on a ridiculous, almost unbelievable coincidence. June 28, 1914. Sarajevo, a restive city in the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the crumbling empire, is on a politically suicidal tour of the city. Why suicidal? Because it was St. Vitus's Day, a Serbian national holiday commemorating a historic battle against the Turks. Sending the Austrian oppressor to parade through the streets on that day was like waving a red flag at a bull. The city was crawling with Serbian nationalist assassins from a group called the Black Hand. Putting the Archduke in an open-top car with minimal security on a publicly announced route was a monumentally stupid mistake to begin with. And, predictably, something went wrong. As the motorcade drove along the river, an assassin threw a bomb. It bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded under the one behind it, injuring several officers. The story should have ended there. A close call. Any sane person would have immediately canceled the rest of the tour and gotten the hell out of town. But the Archduke, a proud and stubborn man, didn't. He insisted on continuing to the town hall for a speech, and then on visiting the injured officers in the hospital. And on the way there, one of the most fatal errors in history occurred. No one told the driver of the Archduke's car that the road had been changed to avoid the city center. The driver, following the original plan, made a right turn onto Franz Josef Street. The general in the car yelled at him, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." The driver slammed on the brakes to turn around right in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. On that exact corner, a 19-year-old assassin named Gavrilo Princip, dejected after the first failed attempt, was standing there, perhaps grabbing a sandwich. Fate, or perhaps sheer idiocy, delivered the target to him like a gift. Stopping 5 feet in front of him, Princip could barely believe his luck. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One hit the Archduke in the neck. The other hit his wife Sophie in the abdomen. 1 month later, the great powers of Europe, tangled in a web of alliances and imperial ambitions, declared war on each other. 20 million people died, 4 empires collapsed, and the modern world was born in the blood and mud of the trenches, all because of a wrong turn and a fatal stop. Sometimes, it's not a grand plan that changes the world, but a coincidence so stupid it's almost unbelievable. Napoleon and Hitler's Russian Winter. The General Winter. Repetition. The philosopher Hegel once said, "The only thing we learn from history is that we do not learn from history." Nothing proves this better than the frozen, nightmarish fates of Napoleon and Hitler in Russia. They were 2 of the most brilliant, ruthless, and successful military commanders in history, and they both made the exact same hubristic mistake. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, marched into Russia with his Grande Armée of 600,000 men, the largest European army ever assembled. He expected a quick, decisive victory against the backward Russians. He was wrong. The Russian army, under Tsar Alexander I, refused to give him the climactic battle he wanted. They just retreated, deeper and deeper into their vast country, burning everything as they went, villages, crops, supplies. It was a scorched earth policy. Napoleon's army, like a giant snake, found its supply line stretched to the breaking point. He captured a deserted and burning Moscow, but it was a hollow victory. He had conquered a ghost city. And then, winter came. Not the gentle, damp winters of France, but the soul-freezing Russian winter. General Winter, as it came to be known, began its relentless assault. Temperatures plummeted to 32. Soldiers froze to death by the thousands, their uniforms in tatters, starving and plagued by typhus. Horses died, forcing them to abandon their artillery and wagons. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out alive. It was the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. 129 years later, Adolf Hitler, another would-be master of Europe, repeated Napoleon's script almost word for word. In 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union with millions of elite German soldiers. He too believed it would be a blitzkrieg, a lightning war over before winter. He famously told his generals, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He too was wrong. The Soviets employed the same scorched earth tactics, trading space for time. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, bogged down in the vastness of the Russian steppe. And then, just like before, winter came. One of the coldest on record, German tanks wouldn't start because their engine lubricant froze solid. Gun oil froze. Soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, because the high command had planned for a quick victory, suffered from horrific frostbite and froze to death in their foxholes. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army was encircled and annihilated, became the turning point of World War II in Europe. Two of history's most brilliant military minds made the exact same, purely arrogant mistake. They thought they could conquer the Russian winter. In the end, they were both buried by it. The Cuban Missile Crisis submarine. The button. A single vote. October 27, 1962. This was the single most dangerous day in human history. The day the Cold War came closest to going hot. The world held its breath as the USA and the USSR played a terrifying game of nuclear chicken over Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba. While Kennedy and Khrushchev faced off in a high-stakes diplomatic battle, the real doomsday clock was ticking deep beneath the ocean, hidden from sight in the claustrophobic confines of a Soviet submarine. The submarine was the B-59, part of a flotilla sent to protect Soviet ships heading to Cuba. It was running deep to avoid detection and had lost radio contact with Moscow for several days. The crew, led by Captain Valentin Sabitsky, had no idea what was happening in the world above. They were blind and deaf. The U.S. Navy, trying to enforce its quarantine of Cuba, located the sub and started dropping small, non-lethal depth charges, a prearranged signal intended to force it to the surface. But inside the overheated, cramped submarine, where temperatures had risen above 120 Bierv, 49 degrees, and the air was thick with carbon dioxide, it felt like the end of the world. Each explosion from the depth charges shook the hull violently. The captain, already stressed and isolated, made a logical but terrifying assumption: World War III had already started, and they were under attack. This submarine was armed with a special weapon, a T-5 nuclear-tipped torpedo with the same destructive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. An order was placed that it could only be launched if 3 senior officers on board, the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander, unanimously agreed. Captain Savitsky, believing his duty was to retaliate, gave the order, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. 2 out of 3. The button that would have vaporized a U.S. aircraft carrier triggered an immediate, massive nuclear response from the U.S. and started a global thermonuclear war that would have killed hundreds of millions, was one single vote away from being pushed. That third vote belonged to a man named Vasily Arkhipov, the commander of the submarine flotilla. In the moment that would decide the fate of humanity, Arkhipov, who had a reputation for being calm under pressure, refused to give his consent. He argued that the American ships were signaling, not attacking, and that launching the torpedo without direct orders from Moscow would be a catastrophic mistake. He got into a furious argument with the captain, but he held his ground. He was the only one in the room who kept a cool head. Somehow, he convinced Savitsky to surface and await orders. When they did, they learned that war had not broken out. Our entire civilization was once just one man's no away from total annihilation. This was the mistake that almost happened, the one that would have ended all the others. The fact that you are reading this today is thanks to the incredible courage of Vasily Arkhipov. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the perfect failure. Assumptions. This was the CIA's most embarrassing chapter in the first major black eye for the young Kennedy administration. It was a covert operation built on a rickety tower of bad intelligence, wishful thinking, and disastrously wrong assumptions. It was, as it came to be known, a perfect failure. In 1961, the plan, codenamed Operation Zapata, seemed simple enough on paper. Train and equip a brigade of 1,400 Cuban exiles, have them invade Cuba at a remote beach called the Bay of Pigs, establish a beachhead, and spark a popular uprising that would overthrow Fidel Castro's new communist government. The CIA, full of Cold War bravado, assured President Kennedy that the plan was a slam dunk. They promised him the exiles would be greeted as liberators, that Castro's army was weak, and that the UFO could be kept a complete secret. Every single one of these assumptions was wrong. It was a perfect storm of failure from start to finish. First, the secret invasion was one of the worst-kept secrets of the Cold War. Cuban intelligence, aided by the KGB, knew an invasion was coming, just not exactly where or when. Castro was ready. Second, the landing site was a tactical nightmare. The CIA chose it because it was remote. But its remoteness also meant it was surrounded by impenetrable swamps, which would prevent the invaders from retreating into the mountains if things went wrong. Third, and most critically, Kennedy, getting nervous about the U.S. being directly and overtly involved, scaled back the promised U.S. air support at the last minute. The initial bombing runs failed to destroy Castro's small air force, and subsequent air cover was canceled, leaving the invading exiles completely exposed on the beach to be strafed and bombed by Castro's planes. And the glorious popular uprising that the CIA had promised, it never happened. The Cuban people did not rise up to join the invaders. Instead, Castro's forces, personally led by the man himself, quickly surrounded and crushed the invasion in less than 3 days. Over 100 exiles were killed, and nearly 1,200 were captured and paraded in front of television cameras, a massive propaganda victory for Castro. It was a total and complete humiliation for the United States. This perfect failure didn't weaken Castro. It made him a national hero who had stood up to and defeated the mighty United States. It pushed Cuba firmly into the arms of the Soviet Union for protection, and it directly set the stage for the far more dangerous Cuban Missile Crisis just 1 year later. An effort to eliminate a perceived threat ended up creating a much bigger and potentially world-ending one. A wrong decision can kill millions. But what if the mistake is the entire system? We continue our descent. Tier 3, the deep sea, systemic errors that change society. The Opium Wars. The Silver Drain. Greed. In the early 19th century, the British Empire, the most powerful entity on the planet, had an embarrassing trade problem. They were addicted to Chinese tea. Tea, along with silk and porcelain, was in such high demand in Britain that a massive river of silver was flowing from London to Beijing to pay for it. The proud British Empire was effectively going broke buying tea from the Qing dynasty. To fix this trade imbalance, the British East India Company, a private corporation with its own army and acting as an arm of the British state, found a perfect and perfectly evil solution: opium. They began to grow vast quantities of opium poppies in British-controlled India, process it into a highly addictive drug, and then, through a network of smugglers, flood the Chinese market with it. This wasn't just business. It was state-sponsored narco-trafficking on an industrial scale. Opium spread through Chinese society like a plague, hollowing out the country from the court officials in the Forbidden City to the common peasants in the rice paddies. Millions became addicts. The social fabric began to tear apart. But for the British, it worked. The silver began to flow back to Britain, balancing their books. The price was the soul of a nation. When the Chinese emperor finally decided to crack down on this existential threat, he appointed an official named Lin Zexu, who seized and destroyed massive quantities of British opium, over 20,000 chests of it, in the port of Canton. The British, outrageously claiming this was a destruction of private property and an insult to their national honor, found the excuse they were looking for. They sent their technologically superior warships and marines. The Opium Wars were a brutal display of industrial military power against a technologically inferior nation. The result was a humiliating defeat for China and a series of unequal treaties that forced China to pay massive reparations, give up the island of Hong Kong to the British, and open its ports to foreign trade. And most ironically and tragically, the opium trade was effectively legalized. This was a systemic error that enshrined drug trafficking in international law. When an empire decides to balance its budget with narcotics and protect that trade with gunboats, it doesn't just start a war. It begins a century of humiliation for a great civilization and writes one of the dirtiest, most cynical chapters in modern history. The Rwandan genocide's ID cards, the identity card, labels. In 1994, in the small, beautiful African nation of Rwanda, known as the Land of 1,000 Hills, nearly 1 million people were slaughtered in 100 days. Neighbors killed neighbors. Friends killed friends. Teachers killed their students. With machetes and nail-studded clubs, the trigger for this explosion of violence was a plane crash that killed the Hutu president. But the root cause, the very tinder that allowed the fire to spread so quickly, can be traced back decades to a simple laminated piece of paper, the Belgian identity card. Before the Belgians arrived as colonial rulers after World War I, the terms Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda were more like social or economic classes than distinct immutable ethnic groups. A wealthy Hutu who acquired cattle could, over time, become a Tutsi. The lines were blurry and fluid, but the Belgian colonial administrators, obsessed with categorization and control, needed a simple black and white system to rule the population. They brought with them the racist pseudoscience of 19th century Europe. They conducted a ridiculous racial census, using calipers to measure nose width and height, to scientifically prove that the Tutsis, a minority of the population, were taller, lighter-skinned, and therefore racially superior and more European-like. They decided the Tutsis were a natural ruling class, and propped them up, giving them access to education and power, while suppressing the majority Hutu. The most fatal step was when they made this artificial division permanent by printing Hutu, or Tutsi, on everyone's mandatory national ID card starting in 1933. This label, the single word, was like a poison injected into the bloodstream of the nation. It turned a fluid social structure into a rigid, inescapable racial caste system. When the Belgians left in the 1960s, they left behind this ticking time bomb of identity politics. The Hutu majority eventually took power and began decades of discriminating against the Tutsis. In 1994, after the president's plane was shot down, Hutu extremists seized the moment. They used radio stations to broadcast hate propaganda, calling Tutsis cockroaches that needed to be exterminated, and their most effective tool was the ID card. At roadblocks, set up all over the country, the Interahamwe militia only had to do one thing: ask for the card. That one word printed on it determined if you lived or died. A colonial administrative error, a label created for convenience, became the bureaucratic engine of a genocide. American Prohibition, the noble experiment. Purity. In the early 20th century, a powerful moral crusade, fueled by a coalition of religious fundamentalists, suffragettes, and progressive social reformers, swept across America. They genuinely believed that if they could just eliminate the source of all social evil, the devil's drink, alcohol, they could create a healthier, more virtuous, more perfect nation, free from poverty, crime, and domestic abuse. In 1920, this noble experiment began. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution went into effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages nationwide. Church bells rang. The famous preacher Billy Sunday held a mock funeral for John Barleycorn. People thought a new golden age, free of drunks and debauchery, had arrived. They were catastrophically, comically wrong. You can outlaw the sale of something, but you can't outlaw human desire. The law didn't stop people from drinking, it just drove the entire multi-billion-dollar industry underground. Overnight, the entire country turned into a playground for smugglers, bootleggers, and the operators of secret bars called speakeasies. And this legal vacuum created something far worse than drunkenness. It created the modern American mafia. Men like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York went from being small-time thugs to the undisputed, fabulously wealthy kings of major cities. They built vast criminal empires on the massive profits from illegal booze, then used that money to buy cops, judges, and politicians, corrupting the system from the inside out. The violence wasn't just bar fights anymore, it was gangsters mowing each other down with Thompson's submachine guns in the streets, like in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. This moral mistake, this attempt to legislate purity, didn't make America cleaner. It created a more powerful and organized criminal underworld than ever before and forever changed the landscape of crime and law enforcement in the country. By 1933, With the country in the grip of the Great Depression and desperate for tax revenue, the government shamefully repealed Prohibition, admitting the total failure of its noble experiment. It was the ultimate proof that when you try to wage war on human nature, you often create monsters far more terrifying than the ones you are trying to destroy. China's Four Pests campaign, the War on Sparrows. Ecology. This is a tragic story of how a nation, in a fit of revolutionary fervor, declared war on nature and ended up starving millions of its own people. In 1958, as part of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, a disastrous campaign to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into a communist utopia, a nationwide campaign was launched to eliminate four pests: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The logic for the last one, promoted by scientists of the day, seemed simple. Sparrows are grain eaters, so killing sparrows will save the grain and increase harvests. What followed was a chillingly effective people's war against the sparrow. Hundreds of millions of people across the country were mobilized. They banged pots, pans, and drums for hours on end, waved flags, and screamed, preventing the birds from landing anywhere to rest. The sparrows, unable to stop flying, would eventually drop from the sky, dead from pure exhaustion. Nests were torn down, eggs were broken, and chicks were killed. The campaign was hailed as a massive success. The Eurasian tree sparrow was nearly eradicated in China. And then, the ecosystem, a delicate and complex web that the planners had completely failed to understand, collapsed. What they hadn't considered was that sparrows don't just eat grain. They also eat a huge number of insects, especially locusts. With their primary natural predator gone, the locust population exploded. Swarms of biblical proportions, unchecked and unstoppable, descended upon the countryside, devouring crops on a scale the sparrows never could have. This ecological mistake, this breathtakingly arrogant attempt to play God with the environment, became a major contributing factor to the Great Chinese Famine, a 3-year period where, due to a combination of disastrous agricultural policies and environmental collapse, an estimated 30 million people starved to death. A war intended to save grain ended up destroying it. It was a horrifying lesson in the complex, interconnected web of nature, and a brutal demonstration of what happens when ignorance is combined with absolute, unquestionable power. The previous mistakes, no matter how bad, at least we can still see, but at the very bottom of the iceberg, are hidden the fundamental mistakes we don't even realize. They are the source code of our world. Tier 4. The Abyss. Foundational Invisible Errors. The inventions of Thomas Midgley Jr., the man who poisoned the planet. Genius. In the Hall of Fame for environmental disasters, one man's name should be in giant flashing letters with a skull and crossbones next to it. But in his lifetime, he was celebrated as a hero of innovation, a genius who solved some of the biggest problems of the industrial age. His name was Thomas Midgley Jr., a brilliant American chemist and engineer. He dedicated his life to making life better, and his solutions nearly destroyed the planet's entire life support system. Mistake Send 1. Leaded gasoline. In the early 1920s, car engines suffered from a violent, damaging problem called knocking. Midgley, working for General Motors, discovered a perfect anti-knock additive, tetraethylate. There were immediate concerns about lead's well-known toxicity. To quell public fears, Midgley held a press conference where he poured the lead compound over his hands and then held a beaker of it up to his nose, inhaling its fumes for 60 seconds, all while declaring he could do this every day without harm. He later had to take a long leave of absence to recover from lead poisoning. He was convincing. Leaded gasoline quickly spread across the globe. What was the price? Over the next several decades, hundreds of thousands of tons of microscopic lead particles were pumped out of tailpipes into the atmosphere, settling in our soil, our water, and our bodies. Lead is a potent neurotoxin. It severely damages the brain development of children. One scientist, Claire Patterson, who fought a lonely, decades-long battle against the powerful lead industry, estimated that it caused a significant drop in the average IQ of entire populations worldwide. We are all, collectively, a little bit dumber today, thanks to Thomas Midgley. Mistake 2. Freon. In the 1930s, the first generation of refrigerators used toxic and flammable gases like ammonia and sulfur dioxide, making them essentially ticking time bombs in people's kitchens. Mitsugli stepped in again, inventing what seemed like a miracle coolant, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, better known by the DuPont brand name Freon. It was non-toxic, non-flammable, and incredibly stable. Once again, Mitsugli held a dramatic press conference where he inhaled a lungful of the gas and then gently blew out a candle with it, proving its safety. The world cheered. Air conditioning and refrigeration became safe and widespread. What was the price this time? That incredibly stable chemical property, the very thing that made it seem so safe, meant that Freon could last for decades in the atmosphere, drifting all the way up to the stratosphere. There, exposed to the sun's ultraviolet rays, it acted as a highly efficient assassin, with a single CFC molecule capable of destroying up to 100,000 ozone molecules. The ozone layer is the planet's sunscreen, protecting all life on Earth from harmful UV radiation. The giant hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica, discovered in the 1980s, was the masterpiece of his safe invention. No single person in history has had a more destructive impact on the atmosphere than Thomas Midgley Jr. He is the ultimate terrifying parable of good intentions paving the road to hell, and we are all still living with the consequences of his genius. The Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa. Straight lines. Open a modern map of Africa, and you'll notice something strange, something unnatural. Many of the borders between countries are perfectly geometrically straight, as if they were drawn with a ruler and a protractor. They were, in the winter of 1884, a group of well-dressed European diplomats from 14 powerful nations met in Berlin at the residence of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The topic of the Berlin Conference wasn't peace or trade, it was how to civilly and legally carve up the entire continent of Africa for themselves, like a giant pie, without starting a war with each other over the spoils. No Africans were invited to this meeting about the fate of Africa. They laid out a crude, largely blank map of Africa, the continent they referred to as the Dark Continent, not because of its people, but because of their own profound ignorance of its geography, cultures, and societies. They didn't care about the thousands of tribes, ethnic groups, languages, and ancient kingdoms that had existed there for centuries. They took out their pencils and rulers and started drawing lines. The Congo would be the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. This piece for Britain, this piece for France, this for Germany, this for Portugal. The process was a grotesque display of imperial arrogance. They drew lines straight through the middle of powerful kingdoms, splitting cohesive ethnic groups like the Maasai and the Somali people between 2 or 3 new European colonies. They drew other lines that forced ancient rival tribes, who had been at war for centuries, into the same new artificial country. This profoundly arrogant act of map-making planted 1 million political and ethnic landmines for Africa's future. When the European powers, weakened by 2 world wars, finally left in the 20th century, they left behind a continent of artificial, often dysfunctional states with nonsensical borders. Many of the brutal civil wars, ethnic conflicts, genocides, and political instabilities that have plagued post-colonial Africa for the last 60 years can be traced directly back to those straight lines drawn on a map in a room in Berlin. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the lost knowledge, blankness. In our age of cloud storage and digital archives, it's hard to imagine the scale of the single greatest data loss in human history, the disappearance of the Great Library of Alexandria. This wasn't just a library. It was the intellectual heart of the ancient world for centuries, a lighthouse of human knowledge and curiosity, founded by the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt around 280 BC. It was more like a modern university and research institute. It held at its peak an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 papyrus scrolls, containing a huge portion of the entire body of knowledge of the ancient world: astronomy, mathematics, physics, biology, medicine, geography, engineering, drama, poetry, philosophy, history. Its destruction wasn't a single dramatic event. as the popular legend of a great fire suggests. It was a slow, agonizing death over centuries, a death by 1,000 cuts caused by a series of mistakes, budget cuts, wars, and acts of fanaticism. The armies of Julius Caesar accidentally burned a warehouse containing some of the library's scrolls during a battle in 48 BC. Later Roman emperors, purging the city of intellectuals, damaged it further. And finally, in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, DC, Christian fanatics, who saw the library's vast collection of pagan knowledge as heresy, are believed to have delivered the final fatal blows, destroying its last remnants. The cost of this mistake, the slow erasure of our collective memory, is incalculable. What exactly did we lose? We might have lost hundreds of years of philosophical works that came after Aristotle. We might have lost a complete mathematical proof of a sun-centered solar system from the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, a scroll that would have put Copernicus 1,800 years ahead of his time. We might have lost the designs for a steam engine created by Hero of Alexandria, a blueprint that could have sparked an industrial revolution during the Roman Empire. We lost entire languages we don't know existed, 90 lost plays by Sophocles, and whole systems of knowledge we can't even imagine. The disappearance of the Library of Alexandria left a giant, unrecoverable blank spot on the hard drive of human civilization. It may have set our entire species back by centuries, perhaps even a millennium, forcing us to rediscover things our ancestors already knew. We will never ever know what we've forgotten. The eugenics movement, the purification of humanity. Purity. This is the terrifying story of how science, draped in the robes of progress and social betterment, became the intellectual blueprint for industrial-scale mass murder. It's an idea that started not in a madman's bunker in Berlin, but in the respectable salons and university halls of the progressive West, championed by leading scientists, intellectuals, politicians, and even presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. The idea was eugenics. In the early 20th century, eugenics, the idea of improving the human race through selective breeding, was seen as the ultimate scientific solution to all of society's problems: poverty, crime, mental illness, alcoholism. The core fatal mistake was the belief that complex human traits and behaviors were determined by simple genetics, and that society could be purified by encouraging the fit to reproduce and preventing the unfit from doing so. In America, this led to seemingly harmless things like fitter families and better baby contests at state fairs, where white middle-class families were awarded medals like prize-winning livestock. But it quickly turned much, much darker. Across the United States, starting with Indiana in 1907, 32 states passed laws allowing for the forced sterilization of anyone deemed unfit to reproduce. Over 60,000 American citizens, the poor, the mentally ill, the disabled, immigrants, and minorities, especially women, were surgically robbed of their ability to have children by the state. The U.S. Supreme Court itself upheld this in the infamous 1927 case Buck Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes infamously writing for the majority. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. But the most horrifying consequence of this scientific mistake was its influence abroad. The Nazi regime in Germany explicitly studied and admired American eugenics programs and laws. The 1933 Nazi law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was largely modeled on American prototypes. Nazi officials praised the American system. The idea that humanity could be purified by eliminating the unfit didn't start with Hitler. It started with progressives who thought they were improving humanity. This foundational error, this perversion of science into a tool of racial and social prejudice, provided the intellectual and legal kindling for the fires of the Holocaust. The real question is not only what mistakes we have made in the past, but what stupid mistakes are we making right now, completely blind to the consequences? I am so eager to find out what errors our generation is committing. Please leave a comment and share your thoughts.